lot of ground to cover today. I am Guy Eakin with the Lipedema Foundation. We're going to go through this, but I'm going to try to do this sort of an easy, I'll talk fast and try to get through a lot, but it'll be kind of an easy introduction because I know it's early in the morning. We're still getting our caffeine. The disclosures, I have to say, nothing to disclose. We received no outside funding, but I will say that if you see a logo on any of the studies that I talk about, that's because it's financially supported by the Lipedema Foundation. Disclaimer, that's the kids don't try this at home message. It's like anything that I talk about today, if you adopt that into your own healthcare, please do so with give some feedback. Do we have both microphones going by any chance? This one, okay. Well, please do so with under consultation of your healthcare providers. So, hey, this is the research roundup from the last year. What can we say about the field as a whole? Well, there's been a lot of continued progress, and one of the things that I talk about all the time is that hockey stick sort of curve of the number of papers and ideas that are coming out in lipedema research, such that if half of the publications in lipedema have been published in the last 4.5 years at this point, which just says that we're really in this renaissance of new information, which allows us to challenge some of the widely held beliefs in the field. A lot of barriers remain. I'm going to have to click through some of these slides quickly, but what we do have is still a small and under-resourced field. And as we think about research, as this field grows, we have to start thinking about what we're asking of both researchers and ourselves. And so what I would mean by that is let's talk about how to evaluate research. So I'm going to say a few words in the beginning here about some tools that we think about at the Lipedema Foundation, but you as consumers of the information can also apply to how you think about the research, because as much as we know that there's a lot of good ideas out there, we all deal in a world with misinformation, and you all are deluged by information out there in the community that, hey, welcome everybody as you're coming in, that you're deluged with information out there in the community that can be of varying levels of confidence. So one of the first ways that we look at research is what we call the level of evidence. And so if you're going to the FDA, you're going to be working up here in that highest level of evidence, those level 1, those randomized clinical trials. We really don't have so many of those in the lipedema field. Historically, the lipedema field has really been influenced by that lowest level of those case reports and good medical opinions. So medical opinions are hard-earned opinions, the expertise of our medical community, but we don't always know if they're generalizable to a wider population. What we're really excited about right now is that a lot of the data that does this have where is my laser on this? Doesn't look like my laser is working. But what we're excited is that we're starting to get into this level 3 data. A lot of the research that's coming out is in this kind of mid-range data. And what that says is maybe we could start stepping back from our reliance on the lower quality data and, thank you. Step back from reliance on that lower quality data and start to ask more of research. So that's just one way that you might think about when you hear new studies, asking what's the level of evidence that they're describing? Have these patients been randomized? Are there appropriate controls? Or is it just somebody's opinion? Another way to think about research is we sometimes say, hey, it's good, it's bad. But we can think about that a little bit more complexly. We can say, well, was the study experiment designed well? Are the results statistically significant? And when those answers are yes, we start to say the study might be valid. And valid doesn't mean that it's necessarily conclusive. It just means that it's a piece of the puzzle. And we're going to get a lot of valid studies together, and they're going to kind of start to show us what direction the field is going. The other way of thinking about studies is about the legitimacy of the study. So you have the validity, which is, was it designed well? And then you have the the validity of whether it was designed well and the legitimacy of like, well, how was it interpreted? You know, what motivations were behind that? And so we could think a little bit more about those ideas of like, are the conclusions consistent with results? We have some big papers out there, and I will say validity of diet studies, I'll use diet studies as an example, the direction is really blowing in the direction that things like a ketogenic diet can be helpful. But we do have some studies that out there that would say, are the conclusions consistent with the results? Well, we have one study out there where they say, yes, the ketogenic diet is going to be helpful for these patients, but when you actually go and look at the data, there was no differences between the intervention, the diet, and those controls. So we would say that's probably not a legitimate study. So keep those words in mind as you start thinking about it. What are the is the study design good? What are the motivations? That's that difference between validity and legitimacy. I can't say enough about the peer review process. That's just something that we want to see in all research that comes out. It doesn't mean that if you read something on somebody's blog that it's wrong. It just means that there's been extra eyes on it, extra eyes from experts in the field. And in this little graphic that you see here, you've got a world expert on something on that left-hand side who submits a manuscript to an editor. That editor is going to send it out to 2 or 3 more experts in the field. And by the time this process is done, that original author has had that idea tested for both its validity and its legitimacy of those conclusions by a number of people. And we just have an increasing level of confidence in studies that have been peer-reviewed. And then just questions that you can ask. And there's one important reason why I use this picture is because I saw it and she was just adorably cute. That's the reason. But the first thing to ask, like, you know, when we're thinking about legitimacy is like, hey, what's this person selling? Are they selling hope? Are they really invested in lipedema research, understanding what lipedema is and all the ideas that might be out there of how to fix lipedema? Or are they selling hype? Are they selling themselves? Are they selling one service? We probably aren't going to have a silver bullet, so we have to be careful to understand the motivations of what are behind the papers. One of the things that's out there, you know, a lot of the information about lipedema is actually drawn from other sources. So the supplement, you know, the ideas behind supplements in lipedema often follow this sort of logic of say, hey, we have these supplements that we think are working well in lymphatics or we think are working well in obesity, and we think that lipedema has similarity to these lymphatic conditions and obesity, and we think, therefore, that these supplements might also be helpful for lipedema, but we have very few supplement studies actually in lipedema that actually tested in real people with lipedema. So you can see it's not that these are bad ideas and that people might not try them, it's just that they don't have the research backing. We should talk about whether or not studies, I think most people have heard this idea of causation versus correlation, and we'll talk a little bit more about that later. And I would ask you all as consumers, as you think about research, to also put on your statistics hat, and that doesn't necessarily mean you have to be a statistician, but one of the simplest little tools you could do is if somebody's telling you in a research study that there was a modest effect, so kind of a slim effect, well, what that means is like to study a slim or a modest effect, you actually have to have a lot of people to be confident in whether or not that modest effect is correct. So think about the study size. And what I would say is that, you know, I mentioned diet studies earlier. Diet studies in general, when we've tried to go back and calculate how many people would be necessary for the typical designs of clinical trials for diet studies, it's 200 to 300 people, but most of our lipedema studies are 50 or less, you know, people. So there's a lot of room to grow in a lot of our studies. Do they have controls? All these sorts of things. So let's keep going. Because I'm going to try to move fast, I'm going to invite you to our booth to hear about a lot of milestones at the Lipedema Foundation itself. We've released a lot of information this year. Really proud of the progress in the registry. Also, just our public education efforts, 170,000 patient and physician education brochures have been delivered this year, but come hear about more at our booth. So let's get into what you actually came here for. So I think we finally got everybody in, they got your coffee running, we could start actually talking about the nerdy stuff, right? So advancing research on the quality of life. Okay, here's the bummer. A lot of the things I'm gonna talk about, you as patients are gonna say, well, no duh, quality of life is reduced, in people who have lipedema. Why is that even important? Well, from a research standpoint, taking those subjective ideas of quality of life, putting a number to them is a really powerful tool because it now helps us ask those questions of what matters to patients, what's going to make their lives better, so that we can take those numbers and apply them to future clinical trials for therapies and have a target, have something that isn't just a subjective, maybe I feel better, maybe I don't, but actually a number that we're targeting, that we're trying to achieve in those clinical trials. So we have some important work this year. Of course, our registry data I presented last year at this talk, and it's available at the booth. We have a appreciation emerging for the diversity of lipedema in our communities. And I'm really thrilled that the next speaker is the next bullet point on my talk as well. And so she's gonna talk, I hope, a little bit about understanding, not just looking at you all and saying, okay, here's a bunch of people with, and there's many conditions in the room, but here's a bunch of people with lipedema, but what are the subgroups of lipedema, and how might your journey with lipedema be different depending, in this case, on demographic factors, what comorbidities you have or don't have, what socioeconomic factors you have. Quality of life, I've talked a little bit about it being sort of a composite number. One of the driving factors of quality of life is, of course, pain. We had Joe Rutkowski, who's also in the room over here, produced a paper this year that's really interesting, and start to look at getting into let's actually look at the neurons, the things that are transmitting our pain, and found in the abdomen of patients with lipedema, that there was actually a reduction in the number of neurons compared to the controls, but not in the thighs, which is where you might think that you would see it. So direction the wind is blowing, validity is there, but it's gonna require more follow-up to understand where this is gonna go long term. The other thing that was interesting is Joe's group started to look at the idea of pain and said, let's get more sophisticated about pain. We know we can have sharp pain, dull pain, burning pain. You can even have pain that is if you have a shearing, a brushing type of that shouldn't be noxious, but elicits pain in lipedema. And what they were able to show is that what's called mechanical allodynia was truly present in the thighs, documenting that in the research literature. And also showing that it wasn't necessarily in the thighs, it wasn't necessarily right above where nodular or textural issues were occurring. So saying that lipedema might be exerting its effects at a distance, which is something that's going to be really important long term, is to think about what are those systemic effects of lipedema. One thing I'll say very quickly about the data is that when you look at the data, I use this as an example, this is a diagram of measurements of pain. And this laboratory used two different tools for measuring pain. And typically in research studies, you see the statistical significance marked up in these, with an asterisk or these bars above the data. And using different tools, in one tool, they were able to show differences between stage 1, 2, and 3 pain. In another tool, they weren't able to show some of those differences. They were only able to show differences between the third stage of pain and the second stage of pain. So if you think for a second about those, what if those were two different studies? Again, they're both valid, but it suggests what the complexity is, why we don't have one study that's entirely confirmative, but we have lots of studies that amass and sort of start to tell us what direction the wind is blowing. So I thought that was a nice illustration of that concept. in the basic sciences, getting to that idea of not just correlation, what are the things that kind of travel with lipedema, but what are the things that actually cause lipedema? We've had a lot of progress this year. So we reported last year on some papers that came out about genetics and about these large studies that look at every area of the genome at the same time. They don't just pick and choose, and how those are starting to show us genes that may be controlling fat differentiation, maybe controlling hormones. That study was replicated this year, and there was a lot of the genes that showed up that actually overlap between the two replicated studies, which is really exciting and a great progress. There's also studies that have been published this year that said, okay, well, let's take, what's our best guesses about what genes might be involved, went and looked at those and said, okay, hey, here's a few family who have perturbations in those genes, and maybe we can begin envisioning what a genetic test might look like. It allows us to start dreaming of of a day when we want to have genetic tests. So are we ready to have genetic tests? I would argue that we're not, because we need to do one thing. We need to get from that correlation to causation. Everything I've told you so far is what the computer has told us. It's what the statistics are telling us. We need to take those back into biological systems, test it, make sure that that those changes in that DNA are really causing a biological effect. Because the problem when we go to a genetic test is we don't want to have a lot of false positives, false negatives. That bad data is worse than no data at all sometimes. The other potential markers that are out there, we have some, whoops, I just lost my, we're talking about the immune system. The macrophage study has been really interesting. We've had, in the past, we've known that there's been mast cells in the lipedema tissue and macrophages, but we don't know if they're innocent bystanders or if they're sitting there holding the gun. Are they actually causing the problems? And so one of the first studies that we have that actually takes macrophages and asks, can they actually be doing something? Takes some of the chemicals that macrophages secrete, puts them onto stem cells, and shows that those stem cells start to behave like lipedema. They start to differentiate into other connective tissues. And that when you take a drug, and it's a laboratory drug, it's not something you could get at the pharmacy, when you take a drug and put them back onto those stem cells, then that behavior is reduced. So if you inhibit what the macrophages are doing, then you actually reduce the ability of those stem cells to differentiate like lipedema. So that's beginning to get to the first suggestions that we actually have causation rather than correlation, which is a really great moment for lipedema research. Other studies, nutrition and metabolism. We didn't have so much published this year. We have a lot of ideas about hypotheses about supplements that have been published. I've talked a little bit about those. The metabolism, there's been studies for a long time. Dr. Herbst had some really nice studies in 2018 that really started to put numbers behind the idea that's been in the patient community for many years, that lipedema is generally metabolically healthy. Starting to drill down more on details, a study from Germany came out and started to say, yeah, actually glucose metabolism is relatively the same, but in their patient cohort, they were actually seeing that there was an issue with higher total cholesterol as well as the LDL bad cholesterol in that study. One of the also remarkable things about that study is they looked at systemic inflammation, so blood draws. So not just looking at tissue in the legs or arms, but looking at blood draws, and so an overall heightened inflammation across the body. I'm not going to say too much about some of these studies, but we're getting to a place where we're starting to test those false positives, false negatives, and move our imaging strategies to say how specific, and how sensitive can our studies be. We also have a lot of studies coming out asking about the question of edema. Even edema that's so minimal that it might not be clinically relevant, can we use that to actually differentiate from lymphedema? Again, very exciting progress. On the therapeutic side, the winds are continue to blow in that direction of conservative therapy being overall very helpful, improving quality of life, body composition maybe, reducing pain, reducing volume, but some surprising changes also in some of these studies. What's going on with sodium in the body, skin temperature, skin thicknesses? Time will tell. We don't know yet, but this is coming out. Don't have too much time left to tell you about the what's coming down the road. I'll have another talk a little bit later to talk a roadmap. Join us at the booth to talk about this. You can reach us or any of our staff very simply, join us on social media. Or I wore a bright orange shirt here for a specific reason. I'm 6'3" and you can see me anywhere. Come talk to us, right? I will say, since I have a minute left, let's talk about semaglutide for a moment. There were a lot of questions in the online app chat about semaglutide. It's a fascinating, people are having great results with it, but we're at that level of evidence that's opinion, right? It's individual people's experiences with it. Are there any studies of lipedema and semaglutide? No, unfortunately not. Where are the studies on semaglutide going to come from? Probably in the larger obesity studies that are run by the pharmaceutical companies. We need to advocate and educate them to be able to identify lipedema in their population so that we can start getting some of that information out. Semaglutide's mechanism of action is really interesting. It's actually, when you really drill down on it, it's actually working to essentially control how fast your stomach empties. So it's actually almost like a diet study, right? And we wouldn't expect, from all the history of all the patient beliefs, the research that's out there, that lipedema is usually resistant to diet and exercise. So it is really interesting to us that people are reporting such effects with semaglutide. We don't know what's going on. Time will tell. 16 seconds left. All right. Well, Cheyenne, how do you want to handle that? Just wrap it up and head it on. Okay, well, get a chance to pass it to the next person then. I think that might be Joanna Falk. Is that right? All right, well, it's a real pleasure to announce one of our furthest traveling guests, Joanna Falk, coming from Sweden, who actually referenced some of her work. So I'm eager to hear more about it.